A German staff officer in Paris reads an intelligence report in early 1944 about American preparations for an invasion of France. He laughs out loud at what he's reading. The Americans think they can land multiple divisions on French beaches, supply them over those same beaches without capturing a major port, and then push inland against prepared German defenses. It's absurd. It violates every principle of military planning. No army can sustain major operations without a port. The logistics are impossible. The Americans are dreaming if they think their industrial capacity can overcome basic military reality. He files the report and returns to planning defenses around Calais, where he's certain the real invasion will occur, as that's where it makes the most sense. 4 months later, that same officer is fleeing east as American forces, supplied entirely over the beaches of Normandy, are driving across France with a logistics operation that's working exactly as planned. This is the story of how German commanders catastrophically underestimated American planning capability, and how Operation Overlord proved them wrong in the most devastating way possible. Let's begin by understanding what German military commanders thought about American military planning in the lead-up to D-Day. The German military had a long tradition of professional military education and sophisticated planning. Prussian military academies had been producing trained staff officers for centuries. German commanders had experience from World War I and the early campaigns of World War II. They'd conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. They knew military operations. They understood logistics, tactics, and operational art. When they looked at American military planning, particularly for amphibious operations, many German officers were openly dismissive. Part of this dismissal was rooted in ideology. Nazi propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, and incapable of the kind of rigorous planning that modern warfare demanded. Germans saw America as a mongrel nation more interested in business than war. They believed American society was too individualistic and democratic to produce the kind of disciplined military organization that Germany had. This wasn't just propaganda talking. Many professional German officers genuinely believed that American military capabilities were overrated. They examined America's performance in World War I, where American forces arrived late and required significant assistance from French and British allies, and assumed that not much had changed. German commanders also had some reasonable grounds for skepticism about an invasion of France. Amphibious operations are incredibly complex and risky. The attacker must land forces on hostile shores, establish a beachhead, and then build up combat power more quickly than the defender can bring reinforcements. Throughout military history, most amphibious invasions have failed. The defender has enormous advantages. They control the high ground. They can prepare obstacles and fortifications. They can mass forces at the point of attack. The Germans knew all this, and they'd spent years fortifying the French coast. They called it the Atlantic Wall, and while it wasn't as impregnable as propaganda claimed, it was still formidable. From the German perspective, any Allied invasion of France faced insurmountable problems. First, the Allies would need to capture a major port quickly. You can't supply a modern army over beaches for any extended period. The volume of supplies needed, the fuel, the ammunition, the food, the replacement equipment, all of it requires port facilities with cranes, warehouses, and rail connections. Landing initial forces over beaches was possible, but sustaining operations required a port. The obvious targets were ports like Cherbourg, Le Havre, or Calais. But the Germans had heavily fortified these ports and had plans to destroy port facilities if they couldn't hold them. So even if the Allies captured a port, it might be unusable for months. Second, the invasion would require air and naval superiority. The Germans acknowledged that the Allies probably had this, but superiority isn't the same as invulnerability. German submarines could still attack invasion fleets. The Luftwaffe, while weakened, could still conduct raids. German coastal batteries and mobile artillery could engage ships supporting the landing. The Allies would take casualties and losses. Third, even if the Allies established a beachhead, German panzer divisions could counterattack before the Allies built up sufficient forces. This had worked for Germany many times. Hit the enemy before they're set, disrupt their plans, create chaos. If executed properly, a panzer counterattack could drive Allied forces back into the sea. Given all these factors, many German commanders believed an Allied invasion would fail, or at a minimum, be contained to a small beachhead that could be eliminated. They didn't think the Allies were stupid enough to try. And if the Allies did try, German forces would defeat them. This confidence was based partly on valid military analysis and partly on underestimating Allied, particularly American, planning and industrial capabilities. The Germans were about to learn a very expensive lesson about that underestimation. Now let's talk about what American and Allied planners were actually doing to prepare for Overlord. The planning for the invasion of Normandy began seriously in 1943, though preliminary work had started earlier. The scale of planning was unprecedented in military history. Every aspect of the operation had to be thought through: where to land, when to land, how many forces, what equipment, how to supply them, how to achieve surprise, how to overcome German defenses. Nothing could be left to chance because the stakes were too high. Failure would mean delaying the invasion for years and potentially losing the war. The first major decision was where to land. The obvious choice from a purely geographic perspective was Calais. It's the closest point to England, which means shorter sea voyage and better air support. It's also the most direct route to Germany. The Germans knew this and heavily fortified the Calais area. Allied planners, led by General Dwight Eisenhower and British General Bernard Montgomery, decided to go with Normandy instead. Normandy was farther from England and seemed like a less logical choice, which is exactly why it might work. The beaches were adequate if not perfect. The terrain behind the beaches was challenging but manageable. Most importantly, the Germans would be less prepared there because they expected Calais. But choosing Normandy created enormous challenges. The beaches were scattered across about 50 miles of coastline. Coordinating landings across 5 separate beaches while maintaining tactical cohesion was incredibly complex. Each beach had different characteristics, different obstacles, and different German defenses. The planners had to account for all of it. They studied tide tables, moon phases, and weather patterns. They needed a low tide to expose German obstacles so they could be destroyed, but not so low that landing craft would ground too far from shore. They needed adequate daylight for the initial assault, but darkness before dawn for airborne operations. They needed reasonable weather for naval operations and air support. The window for all these factors to align was narrow. Then there was the logistics problem that German commanders thought was insurmountable. How do you supply a massive invasion force without a port? The Allied answer was ingenious and something the Germans never anticipated. They'd build their own ports and bring them with the invasion fleet. The Mulberry harbors were artificial harbors that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast. These floating harbors would allow ships to unload supplies directly onto the beaches at a much higher rate than normal over-the-beach operations. This was an engineering marvel. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. The Germans knew about some Allied preparations, but they didn't know about Mulberry. Even if they'd known, they probably would have dismissed it as impractical American dreaming. The Allies also developed specialized equipment to overcome beach obstacles and fortifications. The British and Canadians created Hobart's funnies, modified tanks with flails for clearing mines, bridges for crossing obstacles, and flamethrowers for bunkers. The Americans developed their own innovations: armored bulldozers to clear obstacles, Bangalore torpedoes to blow up the wire, special landing craft designed for specific purposes. This wasn't improvisation. This was a systematic engineering solution to predictable problems. The Germans had built obstacles and fortifications. The Allies built equipment specifically designed to overcome those obstacles and fortifications. Deception was crucial to the plan's success. The Allies created an entire fictional army group supposedly commanded by General Patton and positioned in southeastern England opposite Calais. They built fake installations, generated fake radio traffic, and used double agents to feed false information to German intelligence. The goal was to make the Germans believe the invasion would come at Calais and that any landing at Normandy was a diversion. This deception operation, called Fortitude, was brilliantly executed. German intelligence fell for it completely. Even after D-Day, German commanders believed for weeks that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. This kept significant German forces stationed away from the actual battle, unable to reinforce Normandy in the critical early days. The air campaign before D-Day was also part of the plan. Allied bombers systematically destroyed French transportation infrastructure, especially bridges and rail yards. This was disguised as general strategic bombing, but the real purpose was to make it difficult for the Germans to move reinforcements to Normandy quickly. German panzer divisions stationed in France would have to move by road, which was slower and exposed them to air attack. By destroying transportation infrastructure throughout France, not just near Normandy, the Allies maintained deception while degrading German mobility. The Germans knew their logistics were being hit, but they didn't fully realize it was preparation for invasion until too late. Training was another area where American planning showed its depth. Tens of thousands of troops trained for amphibious operations in England. They practiced beach landings repeatedly. They studied maps and photos of the Normandy beaches. They rehearsed their specific tasks until they could do them under the worst conditions. This level of training preparation was something the Germans underestimated. They assumed American troops would be poorly trained because America had expanded its military so rapidly. What they didn't account for was the American commitment to training and the time invested in preparing for this specific operation. Now let's get to D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, and see how American and Allied planning held up against German defenses and German countermeasures. The operation began with airborne drops behind the beaches. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into darkness over Normandy to secure key positions and disrupt German rear areas. The drops were scattered and chaotic. Many paratroopers landed far from their intended zones. Equipment was lost. Units were mixed up. From a German perspective, watching this unfold, it looked like confirmation that American planning was inadequate. The airborne operations seemed like a disaster. But here's what the Germans missed. The chaos was partly by design and partly a calculated risk that planners had anticipated. The scattered drops actually spread confusion among German defenders who received reports of paratroopers everywhere. Small groups of Americans, even when separated from their units, had been trained to operate independently and accomplish objectives. They caused havoc far beyond their numbers. The airborne operation achieved its strategic purpose of disrupting German responses, even though it didn't go perfectly according to plan. This was American planning working, not failing. The plan had built-in flexibility and acknowledged that not everything would go perfectly. The beach landings began at dawn. 5 beaches, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. The scale was staggering. Utah Beach went relatively well. Omaha Beach was a nightmare of German fire and American casualties. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches saw British and Canadian forces fighting their way inland against determined resistance. The initial reports reaching German commanders were mixed. Yes, the Allies had landed in force. Yes, casualties were heavy at some beaches. But the invasion could still be stopped. German commanders, still believing this might be a diversion, were hesitant to commit their panzer reserves. They needed Hitler's approval to move major formations, and Hitler was sleeping. His staff wouldn't wake him because he'd given orders not to be disturbed. This delay would prove catastrophic. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had over 150,000 men ashore on 5 separate beachheads. Casualties were significant, especially at Omaha, but the landings had succeeded. Now came the real test of American and Allied planning. Could they actually supply this force over the beaches and build up combat power faster than the Germans could reinforce? German commanders were about to discover that American logistics planning was far more sophisticated than they'd imagined. Ships began unloading supplies directly onto the beaches using specialized landing craft. The Mulberry harbors started being assembled. Supply dumps were established. Traffic control was organized to move supplies inland efficiently. The logistics operation in the days and weeks after D-Day was a masterpiece of planning and execution. Over the next few months, the Allies would land over 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies over those Normandy beaches and through the artificial harbors. This was exactly what German planners had said was impossible. You can't sustain major operations without a port, they'd said. The Americans just did it anyway. The logistics weren't perfect. There were bottlenecks and shortages, but the supply chain worked well enough to keep Allied forces advancing despite determined German resistance. German commanders watching this unfold were shocked. The intelligence reports coming back described endless columns of supplies moving inland. American engineering units were repairing roads and building new ones faster than German forces could destroy them. Fuel was flowing forward in quantities that seemed impossible without port facilities. American artillery had seemingly unlimited ammunition for sustained bombardments. German units were rationing shells, while Americans fired thousands of rounds per day. This wasn't what German planning had predicted. This was American industrial and logistical capability operating at a scale that German commanders hadn't thought possible. Coordination of air, naval, and ground forces was also beyond what the Germans expected from American commanders. Allied air forces provided close air support to ground troops, interdicted German reinforcements, and maintained air superiority over the battlefield. Naval gunfire supported ground operations, with battleships and cruisers firing on German positions miles inland. Ground forces advanced methodically, calling in airstrikes and naval bombardment to overcome strongpoints. This combined arms integration was something the Germans respected in theory, but seeing it executed at this scale was overwhelming. The Americans were applying industrial processes to warfare in ways that seemed almost mechanical, but were devastatingly effective. Let's talk about how German commanders responded as they realized their initial assessments were wrong. In the days after D-Day, there was still confidence that the invasion could be defeated. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding German forces in France, pushed for immediate aggressive counterattacks to drive the Allies back into the sea. But the panzer divisions needed for these counterattacks were scattered across France, and moving them to Normandy proved difficult. Allied air power struck at any German column moving during daylight. Roads and bridges were destroyed. Fuel was scarce. Units that should have reached Normandy in days took a week or more. By the time they arrived, the Allies were too strongly established to be dislodged. German commanders also realized that the fortitude deception had worked perfectly. They'd kept significant forces near Calais waiting for an invasion that was never coming. By the time they understood Normandy was the real invasion, not a feint, it was too late to redeploy those forces effectively. Hitler himself had been convinced Calais was the target and was slow to release reserves. This strategic deception, a key part of Allied planning, paid enormous dividends. The Germans fought with one hand tied behind their back for crucial weeks because they'd been thoroughly deceived about Allied intentions. As the battle in Normandy dragged on through June and into July, German commanders had to admit that American and Allied planning had been far more competent than they'd anticipated. The logistics worked. The supplies kept flowing. Allied forces continued to attack despite heavy casualties. The beachhead expanded steadily. German counterattacks were defeated with heavy losses. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen because Allied air superiority was total. German naval forces couldn't interfere because Allied naval supremacy was complete. Every advantage the Germans thought they'd have had was negated by superior Allied planning and resources. The breakout from Normandy in late July was the final proof that Allied planning had succeeded at every level. Operation Cobra smashed through German lines, and American armor poured into the French countryside. The bocage terrain that had slowed Allied advances for weeks was suddenly behind them. German forces, already weakened by weeks of attrition, couldn't contain the breakthrough. The speed of American advance exceeded even Allied planning expectations. Towns that Germans expected to hold for weeks fell in days. The entire German defensive structure in France collapsed. By late August, Paris was liberated, and German forces were in full retreat toward the German border. German commanders who'd mocked American planning in early 1944 were now writing desperate reports about being overwhelmed by Allied material superiority and operational competence. The tone of German military communications changed from confidence to desperation. Officers who'd expected to defeat the invasion were now trying to avoid the destruction of their forces. The planning they'd dismissed as impossible had worked. The logistics they'd said couldn't be sustained were sustaining massive Allied armies as they advanced across France. The American industrial might they'd underestimated was deployed in overwhelming force. Let's discuss specific aspects of Allied planning that German commanders overlooked first: the integration of intelligence and operations. Allied intelligence services, including ultra-code-breaking, gave commanders detailed information about German dispositions and intentions. This intelligence was systematically integrated into operational planning. The Germans knew the Allies had good intelligence, but they didn't realize how good or how effectively it was being used. Second, the flexibility of Allied planning. When things didn't go according to plan, and they often didn't, Allied commanders adapted. The plan for Omaha Beach nearly failed, but junior officers and NCOs took initiative, improvised, and got their men off that beach. This flexibility was built into the system through training and doctrine. Third, the depth of logistical planning. The Germans thought in terms of traditional logistics based on ports and rail lines. The Americans rethought logistics from the ground up. If ports aren't available, build artificial ones. If rail lines are destroyed, use trucks as an alternative. The Red Ball Express, which we've discussed before, was part of this innovative logistical thinking. The Americans didn't just accept constraints. They engineered solutions to overcome limitations. Fourth, the industrial backing. Every aspect of Operation Overlord was backed by American and British industrial production operating at scales the Germans couldn't match. Specialized landing craft, artificial harbors, and enormous quantities of supplies were all produced in quantities that seemed impossible to German planners, who were struggling with shortages of everything. Fifth, the systematic approach to solving tactical problems. Every obstacle on the beaches had been identified, and solutions had been engineered. Hedgerows slowing tank advances, weld steel prongs on the front of tanks so they can smash through, naval gunfire not accurate enough, use forward observers coordinating with ships, air support not responsive enough, assign specific squadrons to specific ground units. The Americans approached warfare like an engineering problem. Identify issues, develop solutions, test them, implement them. This methodical approach wasn't flashy, but it was incredibly effective. The German military tradition emphasized operational art, the ability of commanders to see the battlefield and make brilliant tactical decisions. The American approach emphasized systems, logistics, engineering, and overwhelming force. The German approach produced some spectacular victories early in the war when conditions favored decisive maneuver. The American approach produced sustained success in the grinding attritional warfare of 1944-45, when logistics and industrial capacity were decisive. Operation Overlord was the ultimate expression of American military planning philosophy. It wasn't elegant or brilliant in a traditional military sense. It was thorough, systematic, resource-intensive, and unstoppable. After the war, German commanders who wrote memoirs consistently acknowledged that they'd underestimated Allied planning capabilities, especially American logistics and organizational ability. Rommel, before he died in 1944, had concluded that Germany couldn't win against such overwhelming material superiority. Other German generals admitted that the scale and efficiency of Allied operations in Normandy exceeded anything they'd thought possible. The mockery turned to respect, though by then it was far too late. The planning they'd dismissed had worked, the logistics they'd said were impossible had functioned, and the invasion they'd expected to defeat had succeeded beyond even Allied optimists' hopes. There's a broader lesson here about the danger of assumptions in military planning. German commanders assumed American planning would be inferior because Americans lacked the same army tradition. They assumed logistics couldn't work without ports because that's how it had always been. They thought their operational excellence would overcome Allied material advantages. All these assumptions were incorrect, and each wrong assumption made German defeat more certain. Meanwhile, American planners assumed nothing. They questioned every assumption, tested every concept, and built redundancy into every system. When something didn't work perfectly, they had backups. When Germans expected one thing, they did another. This combination of systematic planning and operational flexibility was something German military culture didn't fully understand until it was too late. Operation Overlord also demonstrated that modern industrial warfare requires a different kind of military excellence than traditional warfare. The romantic notion of brilliant generals winning through superior tactics gave way to the reality that superior logistics, better intelligence, overwhelming force, and systematic planning win wars. The Germans had plenty of brilliant tactical commanders. What they lacked was the industrial base and logistical system to sustain operations against opponents who did have those things. American and Allied planning for Overlord recognized this reality and built a military operation around logistical and industrial strengths rather than trying to match German tactical sophistication. The success of Operation Overlord vindicated American military planning at the strategic level. Eisenhower and his staff had been under enormous pressure from Churchill, Stalin, and American public opinion to invade France quickly. They'd resisted pressure to invade before they were ready. They'd insisted on adequate time for planning and preparation. They'd demanded the resources and equipment they needed. When they finally launched Overlord, it worked because the planning had been thorough and the preparation adequate. The invasion could have been launched 6 months earlier with less preparation. It probably would have failed. The patience to plan properly and the resources to execute that plan were both essential to success. So what's the final assessment? German commanders mocked American planning as unrealistic, overly complex, and doomed to fail against German operational excellence. Operation Overlord proved them catastrophically wrong. The planning was sophisticated, thorough, and backed by industrial resources that German commanders hadn't fully appreciated. The logistics worked at scales that the Germans thought impossible. The coordination of forces exceeded German expectations. The flexibility and adaptation when things went wrong showed that American military culture had its own kind of excellence that the Germans hadn't recognized. By the time German commanders understood what they were facing, it was far too late. The invasion had succeeded, the beachhead was secured, and the Allied advance across France was unstoppable. If this deep dive into the planning behind D-Day showed you a side of Operation Overlord you hadn't considered before, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're exploring the strategic thinking, logistical miracles, and systematic planning that actually won World War II, not just the dramatic battles, but the unglamorous work that made those battles possible. Thanks for watching. Remember, brilliant tactics often lose to superior logistics and thorough planning.